Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Philip Gooding. For this podcast, I am joined by two scholars who will discuss an ongoing collaborative project. They are Dr. Lukas Ley and Tarini Monga. Dr. Ley is a social and environmental anthropologist at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. His research focuses on urban infrastructures, materiality, and social inequality, and his first book was published in 2021 with University of Minnesota Press. It is entitled Building on Borrowed Time, Rising Seas and Failing Infrastructure in Samarang. Tarini Monga, meanwhile, is a PhD candidate at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, whose research focuses on environmental and urban governance in India. Together, Lukas and Tarini are members of a collaborative research project called S.AND, which analyzes sand uses along the shifting shorelines of the Afrasian Sea, which, of course, is also known as the Indian Ocean. So, thank you very much for joining us. The first question I'd like to ask is, what is SAND? How did the project come about? Who is involved in the project? What did you hope to achieve?
Yeah, hi, Philip. Thanks for having us. I'm going to take this question. So SAND is, in a nutshell, is an anthropological research project. It's ongoing, has been ongoing for 3 years now. We're hosted by the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, as you said, and this project is interested in the social properties of sand, sort of the role that sand, more specifically, is playing in protecting urban coasts in the Indian Ocean world, but also beyond. And let me just add, so it's not an acronym, SAND. We kind of use it as sort of a lyrical effort because it's S.AND when you see it written out. So we tried to capture the relationality of sand with this writing, and the thing is, we cannot understand this substance in isolation, but we always kind of consider it as a component in a system where it plays a certain role, where it interacts with other things, whether this is a concrete block used in coastal defense, or, whether it is a coastal ecosystem. So this research project, the way we found each other, it came about after I got a grant from the German Research Foundation, the DFG, which was awarded because I wanted to investigate the place of sand in coastal protection from a social scientific perspective. And the way I pitched this project was as a research group. So we're all kind of nerdy about sand, and we share this fascination with this substance. And there's a total of 4 research projects in this research group, which, as I said, form around this shared passion and interest in coastal design and materiality. So the project hopes to shed light and conceptualize the social affordances of sand. And we can talk about what this actually is. So one ethnographic question would be, how do people actually use this stuff, and to what social, political, economic ends? And the grander ambition, after we've done our ethnography, and we're not there yet, we're still conducting research, started this year. The grander ambition is maybe to write then sand into a larger theory, or into the social history of port cities, which is why sort of the project all look, there's sort of a thread that runs through all the research projects in terms of, we all look at design and the production and maintenance of infrastructures at sea's edge. And this can be coastal defense, or this can be also, in one case, one team member is actually studying the maintenance and engineering of a whole island, the Silt Island in the Bengal Delta, Bhasan Char, which is supposed to host thousands of Rohingya refugees. Yeah, there's also a visual storytelling component to our project, but we can touch on that later. We want to organize an exhibition to sort of mobilize our knowledge for a larger audience.
Okay, why don't we pick up on that then, about the visual component and your use of images. Now, SAND, or S.AND, has a wonderful website with blog posts But one of the things that was really striking about the website is the use of images, that there are original images throughout. Makes it obviously visually appealing. I think that's important for a website, but also it just seemed to have such methodological potentiality. So I wondered how much thought has gone into the creation of this visual archive, and where does it fit within kind of the broader project's mission?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So we as ethnographers, I mean, we are normally using standard sort of methods of qualitative research, which means, interviewing, we do a lot of participant observation. We're using sort of immersive methods to better understand sort of everyday challenges of coastal residents, but also scientists think a lot about erosion. But yeah, we also wanted to capture it visually, kind of offer a more kind of compelling narrative and maybe also gripping sort of narrative of what happens when sand is absent, when actually coasts are eroding. What does that mean for people living on shores? So once you start, however, seriously thinking about sand, you kind of realize, in some ways it's literally everywhere. It's so mundane, people don't really notice it anymore. People don't think kind of creatively about or don't have empathy for concrete things. It's always somewhere in the background, So how do you make it stand out? I think that's kind of the methodological question for us. How do you capture this omnipresence visually, but also sometimes how do you capture its missing, its absence? So or its material properties. That's one thing that we're trying to grapple with. And so to use photography and mapping and film in concert with our ethnographic data, I mean, that's not something we're trained in. So we wanted to get in touch, and we have been exchanging with artists to understand how their engagement sort of with this particular substance produces or can produce really interesting narratives of land laws, of coastal development, and also questions of environmental justice. So just as an example, I think 2 weeks ago, we had the honor to hear the photographer Sim Chi Yin talk about her work on land reclamation in Singapore, but also in China. And that photography that she offers is just mind-boggling. It's showing these weird storage sites for sand, and they're so vast and inhospitable and kind of ludicrous environments because nobody can could possibly live there. It feels like looking at a different planet in her work. But she herself said, that photography feels inadequate sometimes to capture sort of the scope, the scale of sand mining and the worlds that you can create from it. So she was also wondering, how can I complement visual storytelling? What kind of data do I need? What kind of performance do I need? And so we're learning a lot from that. We also invited a material artist, Simone Albers, who's more working with sand and its sort of tangibility, its sort of textures that you can create with it. So for us, I think the answer probably lies sort of in a mix of media, in a mix of these media approaches and sources of information. And we wish to eventually supplement our stories based on the stories that the interlocutors tell us. We want to supplement them sort of with visual material, which could be photography. Maybe just one thing, we also underwent a short GPS training, the group at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, to add sort of more nuance and also some spatial information to photography. If we have a map or just a picture of a site of let's say an ancient sort of sand mine, then we can also use GPS to add another layer of information, depth, volume, sort of thinking about connections, movements of sand between different sites. But yeah, we definitely realize we don't have sufficient training as anthropologists, and we need to look to other practitioners and actors to learn from them how to tell compelling stories.
That's really, really interesting. It's something that we're thinking through as well at the IOWC, and perhaps it's something we'll discuss offline after we've finished recording this. But you kind of really touched on something there in both of your answers about sand being omnipresent in the background. You're trying to capture also what happens when it's missing. This kind of gets to one of the core questions. How does sand shape the futures of coastal cities? Meanwhile, you find that coastal cities and uses of sand are encroaching on rural and coastal livelihoods. Thus, I wonder, can this be reconciled? Are there futures for example, artisanal fishing, communal salt pans, river deltas, agriculture, in the context of increased urbanism and industrial uses of sand? And what shape might they take?
Sand, or the uses of sand, its movements, once you study them, you certainly become aware of sort of long-term histories of how environments were shaped by urbanization, by sort of industrial infrastructures. And we are very interested in historicizing sand uses because, to situate or really analyze current use forms and values of material, of sand specifically, you need to understand, of course, the pathways and sort of the cultural practices that have emerged with sort of with building coastal cities. Yeah, so we're not sure there's a conflict, right, between sort of having sort of a dense understanding of long-term histories and how sand uses over time shape the future. But maybe, yeah, I think Tarini is also really looking at how those timescales coalesce in Goa.
Yeah, I agree with Lucas that it's been quite generative to see these sort of timescales together rather than in conflict. So, for instance, where I do research in Goa in India, sort of becoming aware of these long-term histories of land use, for example, has been especially helpful in understanding a future potential of these spaces. So in the case of agricultural fields, doing this historical work has allowed me to ask questions like, will these fields erode? Will they be repatched, for instance? Are these spaces an everlasting feature of the landscape? What makes them resilient in the face of rising sea levels or temperature changes? And so historical engagements, thus whether it's in terms of land use or fishing movements, often even labor histories, has really helped kind of understand current forms of use, as Lucas said, but that also which dictates a potential understanding of a future, whatever that might look like.
That's really interesting. And Tarini, thank you very much for jumping in there. So of course, yeah, your research is focusing on Goa in Western India. And I wonder if you could just give us some kind of background here to sort of give kind of a flavor of the broader questions that I know are being answered by the wider project too. So what are the major ecological challenges and opportunities currently facing agricultural farmers around Goa? And how are they managing them, particularly as they speak to the wider themes of your project?
Right. Thanks. I mean, I think I've been doing fieldwork for about 5 months now, and the field note that we also talk about quite briefly gives you a glimpse into these low-lying fields which dot Goa's waterfronts. So this system of agricultural spaces which were reclaimed from the river or sea, which are known as khazans, are a heritage system which were engineered to serve not only or increase not only agricultural land, but are sort of resilient forms of natural defenses. So historically, and this is kind of what drew me, one of the main things which drew me to Goa was that historically these spaces were communally held and typically have also 4 key material features, which I kind of highlight in some of my writing, but 2 which have come to be quite central to my work are, one is this sort of sluice gate or a water inlet, which is opened and closed as per tidal patterns and controls saline ingress into fields. And the second being inner and outer embankments, which are usually made and repatched using mud and clay from surrounding marshy areas. And I've been keen to understand these elements within the system as a whole and how do shifts in material changes to any part of it impact the use of land today. So today, these areas have been subject to, as in many places around the world, various forms of private acquisition for construction, for example, or material dumping, cases of landfilling. And so for me, this kind of like really is what also caught my attention, to divert attention from not just large scale extraction and mining, but kind of also these edgeland spaces which are subject to so many forms of acquisition, private acquisition. And the other thing for me with the cousins was looking at them as a commons. And that's sort of how that kind of gave rise to some interesting questions about ownership and changes to it. So how have shifts in regimes of this ownership and communal management of a space impacted the usability of these fields? So even though the larger sort of agricultural practices are not necessarily the most economically incentivized or even viable today, but how do various citizenry efforts and modes of governance keep these spaces alive? And kind of also then speaks to this broader questions of a future and resilience of coastal cities. And to maybe explain this a little bit better, my more recent work has been around following dredging projects on riverfronts. So these are usually state efforts to restore freshwater flow and fishing habitats. But in following how these are executed, I've been able to sort of look at the role of silt as a material which occupies quite a specific place in vocabularies of governance. So it's often seen as this in-between thing which needs to be removed, but you're not really sure what to do with it. So one case I observed of this uncertainty is when this quote unquote excess material, which is accumulated on rivers, is left on low-lying fields or in cousin areas, which are legally deemed as eco-sensitive regions. So this, as we can imagine, comes with the whole bureaucratic mess, which makes it all the more challenging to manage. So how much sediment is actually removed from the river? Where is it dumped? Who is responsible to monitor the dredging process are often some of the many questions which remain unanswered. But this sort of messy network, and I hope I kind of answer your question, helps me to answer how various ecological, economic, and even legal processes converge at these marshy spaces. And that's the role of the material in kind of visualizing this coming together of this network.
It's absolutely fascinating, the way you're describing this. And actually, it speaks to some really interesting, I think, disciplinary questions. And perhaps you'll forgive me for this, because obviously you guys are trained in anthropology and I'm originally trained in history. So maybe this is a little bit basic from my part. But the S.AND project seems to me very much like an ecological, environmental project. But what you're talking about here has a lot of social, economic, and political elements. And obviously, this is a project being held at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. And thus, could you speak to perhaps the kind of the disciplinary influences here? It kind of feels like it's very much like an environmental humanities kind of project, but also this is being really well informed by social and economic history and anthropology. So how does a training in social anthropology and being hosted at an Institute for Social Anthropology kind of inform these environmental questions? Maybe you could speak to your background a little bit here, Tarini, first. Like, were you trained in social anthropology first before moving into this environmental questions? And then maybe you could talk, Lukas, afterwards about this kind of the wider institutional and disciplinary framework.
Yeah, thanks. That's a question we also ask ourselves all the time. But yes, I was trained in anthropology, social anthropology, and also from, I think, what I would consider questions which excited me initially were also quite traditionally in political economy of materials and resources, which kind of brought me into the field. And while we came together through this project on SAND, I think there were a lot of broader questions about resources which excited all of us. And I think that's been at the heart of many of our conversations. So, for instance, for me, I've found that land and ownership, for example, is at the heart of most questions that I encounter here in Goa. And it's almost impossible to look at ecological crisis or an ecological moment in isolation to these processes. So it's inevitable that these lines of thinking kind of converge during my time in the field. And for example, everything that I just described and looking at materials like river sand or silt, which kind of take on various forms, what I'm really interested to ask are questions about value and how resources come to be valued. And these have been at the center of anthropological and economic research for very long. And while processes of, for example, sand mining have received a lot of attention, it's also important to look at extraction and accumulation as beyond this large-scale industrial mining action and as processes which continue through various guises of state action or public-private interventions. And our role then is to kind of have or use this ethnographic attention and bring it to these waterfronts to really help further an understanding of what these messy and complicated networks of change really look like. And I think Lukas can also speak to this a bit more because we've been talking about these observations for quite a while now.
Yeah, I think I find it quite intimidating to have conversations with scientists, right? Geologists. It's always been it's a steep learning curve, and sometimes it's a question we certainly have to explain what it is we're looking for and why. So, but it's been both challenging and rewarding. I think in Marseille, but also in Denpasar, which is my second research site, our interest in sand is quite timely, and it's also quite fitting. People realize these understandings of sand as a commodity, as a resource, do not suffice, right? They have not prevented encroachments on ecosystems, on commons, as Tarini just described. So we need different understandings. We need a different conceptualization of this thing and its many relations, maybe its histories and its positions, not just in science, but also in sort of cosmological systems, in stories and in everyday life. So I think there's been generally a welcoming attitude towards our project. And we also try to explain often in the field, but also at presentations, that, you know, when you follow a political ecological approach, you think of the environment as something that is obviously biological and geophysical and chemical, but it is also created by social systems and penetrated, you know, by social practices. Modes of production have been shaping the environment in which we live. It's part of larger landscape designs. It's everywhere in the city. And I found Anna Tsing's notion of the patch really useful also, in thinking about sand and more generally ocean sediments, or more specifically sediments in the Bay of Marseille, because you know long-term histories of living or of industrializing Marseille shore have produced the existence of these sediments that required changing not only the port and the nearshore environment, but it also required changing the hinterland of the city and its oceanic environment, like draining wetlands for railway systems, damming and burying rivers, deepening waterways to increase navigability, and so on. So when you get at these kind of coastal patches, sort of infrastructures that go haywire, and specifically in the context of climate change, it's important to see sort of these layers of sand and mud as historically produced, and they're now laced with contaminants. And we, the economy, we made these patches.
This is absolutely fantastic research. I want to touch on something else which is on the website, which is something you've called the Public Sandbox, which is a great name, and is a Zotero public literary database on sand. And it's being public sandbox, it's completely open access, I believe. And this kind of maybe comes back to one of the questions I asked earlier about the fact you making a visual, basically a visual archive here, as well as making things that are kind of engaging and available to wider publics and the wider research community. But I just want to know more about this public sandbox. What inspired you to make this resource? What materials does it contain? And also, how are you organizing it? Are you organizing it by discipline, by region? Please tell us more.
Yeah, sure. As you said, it's a growing sort of database, literary database, the Public Sandbox. I think it was one of the first ideas I wanted to take up at the beginning of the project, when of course you're trying to sort of map the literature landscape, everything that has been written about sand and geography, where most of the kind of studies on extraction have appeared. But also beyond. I mean, in geology, political geology was popping up at the time. There's a lot of political ecological studies of commodities and resource environments. So we wanted to just get a better sense of this. And as I was navigating this wealth of studies, I created a database on my laptop, as most of us do, I think. But I noticed at the same time how, in Nature, but also other publications, pieces were coming out that were warning of the impending sand crisis. I also noticed this really strong interest in this resource and its limitations, and how it will potentially mediate how sea level rise is happening, globally. So I decided, this has to be a public database, since this interest in sand is so widespread. And we wanted to also make sure, as a research group at a, kind of elite German institution, we also wanted to make sure we stay in touch with everything else that was fermenting at the time at different, not just at academic institutions, because there's also museums that currently organize a lot of exhibitions on sand. There's less sort of scientific publications that are coming out. I'm thinking of Beiser's work on the sand crisis. And so we wanted to make this knowledge sort of spill over into other domains, while also showing, there's a lot of literature that we're dealing with that we don't fully know how to make this work for us as social scientists, but we will be drawing on this in some way, in some capacity.
That is wonderful, and I look forward to consulting with this moving forwards as well. All right, final question about sand. The second post on the website is a joke, which is great. Why did the sand go to therapy? Because it had too many issues with its self-esteem. It just couldn't find its grit. Absolutely perfect. Do you have any other sand-based jokes you could share with us?
Tarini, do you remember if we copied this joke from a website or if this was actually a member of the team who invented it?
I'm not sure, but I want to say we invented it.
We had the absolute pleasure of working with a team of 2 graphic designers in creating this website. And they asked us a lot of funny questions and they had cool ideas for content. And I think the team also just wanted to, as I said, not be too, academic and sort of come out of the ivory tower. And so they suggested a joke. I'm not sure where they found this joke. We have thought about additional jokes, yes. And I'm not sure if this today is the premiere of this new joke.
And in that case, I'm going to urge everyone to go on the website and look for the next installment of the next installment of Great Sand Hilarity. I think it's a perfect addition, and I think it should be more of this, please. All right, final question then. What's next? Obviously, Tarini, you are in Goa conducting fieldwork at the moment. Much longer are you out there? What do you plan to do next? And Lukas as well. What's next for the wider project?
Well, I'm here for another 5 months at least, which allows me to do significant amount of more sort of fieldwork and getting to know more about Goa and this sort of region, and also kind of working through some regional overlaps with the others and really trying to like think together about various maybe ideas of connectivity and how kind of the projects really work together. In this time, we've all tried to sort of stay in touch and keep each other posted on how things are developing and kind of what are new ideas. And I think sometimes almost annoyingly keeping each other updated about things that are exciting and just kind of new avenues in which research is going, whether it's looking at sort of new forms of construction or alternative materials or things that excite us. But I think for me, it would be then returning back to the team and kind of taking inventory of everything that's happened over the last 12 months and begin sort of my writing process for the thesis, but also sort of working together to see, well, one, work on our exhibition project, but also other sort of team activities that we have in the pipeline.
Yeah, Taini said it beautifully. Yeah, we're working on a number of things. I mean, the PhD projects are just really important and so generative right now. So it's they are the priority right now, I guess. Each PhD candidate has about 12 months of research at the respective sites. Teresa Kramer has already departed for Mombasa in Kenya. I received a really funny image from her recently. Taini mentioned our WhatsApp group where we try to sort of share updates and what's going on in our lives. And I saw an image of her riding a donkey that is transporting sand from a sand mine. So it looks like she's making great progress down there. And Javed Kaiser, who's doing this research in Bangladesh on the char, is returning to his field site, I think, this month. Tarini is already conducting back at the field site and conducting field work. And I shall return to Marseille next month because it's dredging season in Marseille. Usually in autumn, there's a bunch of sort of leisure or smaller ports that require dredging. And that's kind of a delicate matter because that sand, mud, and silt is heavily contaminated. And so the city doesn't really know what to do with it at the moment. There's a lot of bureaucratic obstacles. And so I'll try to observe the dredging and how they deal with a chemical burden of sediments. And then next year, hopefully, the plan is to return to Denpasar, and then I think dredging will be the connective tissue, linking these projects as Bali is trying to develop its shore for, in the wake of its energy transition and to create more energy autonomy through LNG terminals. And to build these terminals requires a lot of dredging, which is strongly opposed by the Adat communities in the south of Bali.
Wonderful research, wonderful project. Good luck as it continues with the wider projects, with your PhD research, Tarini, and to your wider PhD candidate team. This is really fantastic stuff. Thank you very much for discussing it with us. I want to thank Sam Gleave Riemann as well, who organized and has produced this podcast. Obviously, want to thank you, the listener, as well, for streaming or downloading. Just to close out, once again, my name is Philip Gooding. And this is the Indian Ocean World podcast.
We would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The Indian Ocean World podcast is produced under the SSHRC-funded Partnership, Appraising Risk, past and present. The podcast runs in conjunction with the annual speaker series at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill University, Montreal.